Your lesson essential question is, how do we explain connections in historical texts? So today you'll be explaining how the details are connected. Yesterday we talked about how key details in informational texts are tied together in specific ways. We talked about how the first step to identifying those connections is first figuring out what type of informational text you're working with. Is it a historical text, a scientific text, or steps in a process? Then, you need to look for keywords that connect the key details. This is what you did in your assignment yesterday. Last, you identify the text structure. Is it sequence, telling the order of events? Is it compare and contrast, or is it cause and effect? Last, you're going to use specific text structure words as you describe the relationships in the text in writing and in speaking. So yesterday you read a text and it was already identified as sequence. You went through that text and you looked for words that showed sequence as your assignment. Today we're going to work on this graphic organizer together to identify the key details. First, let's read the text and identify some of those sequence keywords. Adventures of the growing nation. Imagine that in one day our country doubled in size. That's what happened to the United States in 1803. In 1803 shows when something happened, so it shows sequence. President Thomas Jefferson asked France to sell the United States a vast area of land. Overnight, America added more than 828,000 square miles of land west of the Mississippi River. This is known as the Louisiana Purchase. The word overnight shows when something happened. Jefferson wanted to know the fastest way across the new land. At the time, there were no maps of the whole country. Jefferson asked Meriwether Lewis to explore the area. Lewis was an army captain whom Jefferson trusted. Lewis chose another soldier, William Clark, to help him lead the party. To get ready, they first had a large boat to build. First tells us what they had to do at the beginning of their adventure. The boat took the men down the Ohio River. Then they built a base camp near St. Louis, Missouri. They spent the winter of 1803 there. The word then tells us what happened next. Winter of 1803 tells us when it was happening. Finally, on May 14, 1804, Lewis and Clark began their famous trip into the new territory. 50 men went with them. Finally, on May 14, 1804, tells us what happened last. They traveled for over 18 months. 18 months tells us how long. Finally, the group made it to the Pacific Ocean. On November 7, 1805, Clark wrote, "Ocean in view, oh the joy." The group spent a long cold winter near the ocean. They began the trip back home in March 1806. These dates tell us when these events happened. Lewis and Clark arrived in St. Louis in September 1806. They were greeted with a big party. A century later, in 1904, the World's Fair was held in St. Louis. People honored Lewis and Clark's journey at the fair. So you can see there are a lot of sequence words in this informational text. Now let's identify some of the most important details. We know that first, President Jefferson asked Meriwether Lewis to explore the new land. Let's find what happened in winter 1803. I found the key detail that they spent the winter of 1803 in their camp in St. Louis. So in the winter of 1803, they built their camp and they stayed there. Now let's find what happened in May 1804. I found finally on May 14th, 1804, Lewis and Clark began their famous trip into the new territory. So Lewis and Clark began their trip. Now let's see what happened in November 1805. Let's see if you can find that key detail. You probably found that that's where they made it to the Pacific Ocean. And last, let's identify what happened in September 1806. The last paragraph says that Lewis and Clark arrived in St. Louis in September 1806. You're going to be answering a discussion post today talking about how some of these paragraphs are connected. Make sure you're thinking about sequence as you're answering the question.